The hall was on fire with light. The night Seraphina almost ran. She stood pressed against the stone wall near the kitchen entrance, holding a tray of empty goblets, watching the crowd below. Hundreds of wolves filled the great hall of the Blood Moon Palace. Lords and ladies in deep red and silver. Pack alphas in polished armor. And at the center of it all, King Alaric Vane, sitting on his throne like a man who had never once been told no. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair and cold gray eyes that swept the room the way a blade sweeps air, cutting through everything without caring what it touched. Seraphina was 22 years old and had lived in this palace for 11 years. Not as a guest, not as a ward. As the daughter of a lord who had taken a second wife after her mother died, she had slowly been pushed from every room that mattered, until only the corners were left. Her half-sister Celeste had the fine clothes, the soft hands, the seat at the banquet table. Seraphina had the early mornings, the cold water, and the careful silence that kept her from being noticed. Tonight was the crowning moon ceremony. Once every 7 years, the moon goddess was said to reveal fated mates through a sacred light that passed through the ceremonial window above the throne. Lords traveled from 3 kingdoms for it. Some said it was tradition, some said it was real. Seraphina had always believed it was real, quietly, in the way people believe things they are not allowed to say out loud. She was not supposed to be in the hall at all. Celeste had ordered her to clear the upper corridors during the ceremony, but one of the younger kitchen girls had dropped a tray near the main entrance, and Seraphina had come to help, and now here she stood, too close to the center of things, holding an empty tray and trying not to breathe too loudly. The priests began their chant. The candles dimmed. The great ceremonial window above the throne filled with moonlight, not silver, not white, but the deep, warm gold that the old writings described. It moved slowly across the hall like a searchlight, drifting over faces, over shoulders, over outstretched hands. People held their breath. Some couples reached for each other hoping. Some alphas stood rigid, eyes closed. The light passed over Celeste, who stood in the front row in a gown of pale blue, her dark hair pinned with pearl combs. It did not stop. Celeste's jaw tightened, but she kept her smile in place. The light moved on. It floated past lords and ladies and visiting dignitaries, and then, without warning, it swung sharply, cutting across the entire length of the hall, and landed on the kitchen entrance, on Seraphina. She felt it before she saw it, a warmth against her skin, starting at her wrist and climbing to her chest, and then the light was pouring over her, golden and full and undeniable, and she could not move. She could not speak. Her whole body felt like it had been struck by something ancient and certain, the way a compass needle swings and locks north without asking permission. The hall went absolutely silent. Every head turned. Hundreds of eyes, finding her. The girl in the worn gray dress with flowers still on her sleeve and an empty tray in her hands. And then a second thing happened, which made the silence worse. King Alaric Vane rose from his throne. He was not supposed to rise. The ceremony required stillness. But he stood, and his gray eyes, which had never once looked at Seraphina in 11 years, found her across the crowded hall with a precision that made her stomach drop. She saw the moment he recognized her. Not her name, not her face. He had never bothered with either. But what she was to him. His jaw locked. His hands closed at his sides. The mate bond did not ask for permission either. It simply arrived, and it was as clear on his face as it was burning on her wrist. Seraphina watched him understand, and then she watched him decide. The decision took 3 seconds. His expression moved through something that might have been shock, then something that looked almost like fury, and then it settled into something harder than either. A king's face. A man who had already made up his mind. He sat back down. He signaled to the high priest. He said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "Continue the ceremony." The light had already faded. The moment was over. The crowd began to murmur, confused, looking between the king and the gray-dressed girl near the kitchen entrance. Seraphina did not wait to hear what came next. She slipped back through the kitchen door, set the tray down on the stone counter, and pressed her back against the cold wall. Her wrist was burning. The mark was already there. She could see it glowing faintly beneath her skin, a crescent shape in pale gold. The goddess had chosen. The goddess had been very clear. What happened next was not the goddess's doing. The king's guard came for her before dawn. There were 4 of them, in full armor, filling the narrow doorway of the servants' quarters. The other girls pressed against the far wall, wide-eyed. Seraphina did not beg. She had learned a long time ago that begging only told people how far they could push. She put on her shoes, straightened her dress, and walked out with them quietly. They brought her not to the throne room, not to any chamber she had ever cleaned or passed through. They brought her to the lower hall, where the ancient law texts were kept, where the old king's portraits watched from the walls with painted, indifferent eyes. Alaric was already there, standing with his back to the door. He did not turn when she entered. "You are aware," he said, "of what the ceremony showed." "Yes," Seraphina said. "I am going to marry Celeste." She had known this was coming, and she had known it for longer than one night. Celeste's engagement to the king had been the open secret of the palace for 2 seasons. Lord Harwick, Celeste's father, and Seraphina's stepfather, had arranged it with the precision of a man collecting debts. He had armies. Alaric needed them. Celeste was the price. "I understand," Seraphina said. Alaric turned then. He looked at her, the way a man looks at a problem he resents having to solve. "You cannot be permitted to take another mate," he said. "The bond will not allow it. And I will not have an unclaimed fated mate walking free in my kingdom while I am married to her sister. The political consequences alone would be enough to start a war." Seraphina said nothing. She was already working out what was coming. "There is a law," he said. "Old, rarely used. A king may place his fated mate under royal bond claim. It is not slavery." He said the last word as though correcting her before she could speak it. "It is a legal status. You would remain in the palace. You would be provided for. You would simply be bound. To serve," Seraphina said. "To remain," he said, "under my authority, without the freedom to leave, take employment outside this palace, or form a bond with another." She looked at him for a long moment. His face gave nothing. He was not asking. He was informing her of what had already been decided. The documents were on the table behind him. The palace keeper was standing in the corner with a pen. Everything was already arranged. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "You cannot refuse," he said simply. "It is the king's right, under the old law." The mark on her wrist burned like a coal. The goddess had given her a king. The king had turned that gift into a chain. Seraphina looked at the documents, at the pen, at the man who could not even look at her directly for more than a moment, before his eyes slid away. She thought about running. She thought about screaming. She thought about the 11 years of quiet and cold water and careful silence, and she thought about how none of those things had broken her yet. She walked to the table. She picked up the pen. She signed. "Good," Alaric said. He was already turning away. "You will be assigned to the household staff, under the head housekeeper. You will not attend formal events. You will not speak to Celeste unless she addresses you first." Seraphina set the pen down. "And the ceremony?" she said. "What will you tell the court about what the light showed?" He paused with his back to her. "Nothing," he said. "The light was unclear. These things happen." He walked out. The palace keeper gathered the documents. The guards waited by the door. Seraphina stood alone in the lower hall, surrounded by old portraits and older laws, with a burning mark on her wrist and a signed paper that had just turned her into property. The candles guttered in the draft from the closing door. She did not cry. She had cried all she was going to when her mother died. There was a different thing in her chest now. Not grief, not rage, but something quieter and more durable. A decision, the same way his had been a decision, settling into place, bone deep. She was still here, she was still breathing, and something that had been watching tonight from the sky above the ceremonial window had not looked away. She pressed her hand flat against her wrist, feeling the warmth of the mark beneath her palm. Whatever was coming, she would be ready for it. She walked back toward the kitchens. The day of the formal engagement announcement arrived 3 weeks later, dressed in spring weather and palace banners. Celeste swept through the morning in a gown of ivory and rose gold, accepting the congratulations of every lord and lady in the palace with a smile that had been practiced down to the exact angle. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberately, completely, with no detail left to accident. Lord Harwick stood beside his daughter at every turn, shaking hands and accepting praise with the satisfaction of a man watching a long investment finally pay out. Seraphina pressed Celeste's gown. She pinned Celeste's hair. She carried the train of Celeste's court dress through 3 separate corridors, while lords bowed and servants stepped aside. She did all of this without expression and without comment, because that was the condition of her remaining in the palace, and because she had decided, in the quiet hours of her first night under bond claim, that she would survive this by being impossible to destroy. Celeste did not acknowledge her during any of it. Not directly. She spoke around her, through her, past her, put that down there, and fix the left side, and don't stand so close when there are guests. 11 years of half-sisterhood had trained them both well in the art of pretending the other was not quite a person. Only once did Celeste slip. It was in the dressing room, with the ladies-in-waiting excused for a moment, and only Seraphina left, working at a loose thread on the hem. Celeste looked down at her, and something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt, not quite. Something more calculating than that. "You should be grateful," Celeste said. "He could have sent you away entirely." Seraphina did not look up from the hem. "Yes," she said. "He chose mercy." "Yes," Seraphina said again. Celeste studied her for a moment, searching for the thing she expected to find. Bitterness, resentment, anything she could use. And when she did not find it, her expression tightened very slightly. "You are very quiet," she said. "I am always quiet," Seraphina said. She tied off the thread, smoothed the hem, and stood. Celeste turned away, and the moment was over, and Seraphina carried it out of the room with her, the way she carried everything, carefully, and without showing how much it weighed. She had found 2 allies in the weeks since the ceremony, though she would not have called them that to their faces. The first was Marin, the palace healer, an old woman with gray braids and sharp brown eyes, who had served 4 kings and seemed to have formed a settled opinion of all of them. Marin had found Seraphina sitting alone in the herb garden on the 3rd night, staring at the moon. She had sat down beside her without asking, handed her a cup of something warm, and said, "The bond mark is giving you pain." It was not a question. "A little," Seraphina said. "It will settle," Marin said, "or it will not, depending on what he does." She looked at the mark for a moment, then looked away. "Your mother had green eyes," she said. "Same shade as yours. I tended her once. When she was carrying you, she was kind." Seraphina looked at her. "You knew my mother?" "I know everyone who has ever passed through this palace," Marin said. "That is the advantage of being old and quiet. People forget you are in the room." They had sat together in silence after that, and something had settled between them that did not need naming. The second ally was Bastian, a palace guard of 30 years who walked the east corridor every evening and had, on 2 separate occasions in the past year, quietly replaced trays that Celeste had knocked from Seraphina's hands without acknowledging it. He said very little. He had a broad, weathered face and the kind of loyalty that attached itself to people rather than titles. Seraphina did not fully understand yet why he had chosen her, but she had begun to suspect it was connected to something he had known before she arrived. The weeks passed. The engagement banners stayed up. The palace moved through its preparations, with the efficient energy of a machine aimed at a single outcome. Seraphina was given the task of coordinating the guest linens, the table settings for the formal dinner, and Celeste's particular choice. And Seraphina understood exactly what it was: the sewing of the wedding gown. She worked on it every night in the small room she was permitted to use near the laundry. White silk, thousands of tiny seed pearls, a train that would take 6 people to carry. She sewed it with skill, because she had been taught well, and because doing poor work would only give them something to punish her for. She sewed it with care, because she was, despite everything, someone who did things properly, and she sewed it in silence, with the mark burning on her wrist, and a woman's voice, somewhere at the back of her mind, soft and low, saying things she could not quite make out. She first noticed the voice in the 4th week. It happened during the night, when she was half asleep over the wedding gown. A sound, not quite a sound, more like the feeling of a sound, that carried something like warmth. She sat up. The candle was still burning. The room was empty. But the air felt different, thick with something charged and attentive, the way the air feels before a thunderstorm. She pressed her hand against the window. The moon was above the garden, full and white, and as she watched, it seemed, just for a moment, to look back. She was not afraid. She did not know why she was not afraid. She should have been. But the warmth in her chest held, and the voice settled into a single word, clear as a bell, spoken once. Endure. She lowered her hand. She went back to her sewing. A month before the wedding, something happened that Seraphina had not planned for. Alaric held a feast for the visiting pack alphas, and Celeste required Seraphina to serve at the table. It was deliberate. Seraphina saw that immediately. Celeste had a particular talent for arranging humiliations, so they looked like logistical decisions. The head steward was unwell. There was no one else available. It made perfect sense for Seraphina to carry the wine. She carried it. She moved through the hall efficiently, refilling goblets, keeping her eyes forward. The pack alphas were loud and warm and already deep in conversation. She navigated around them without touching, without speaking, without drawing attention. She made one mistake. She walked too close to the king's table. She had not meant to. The other server had gone the wrong way, and she had corrected her path, and for 5 seconds she was standing near the end of the king's table, within the range of the bond. She felt it immediately. A pull, not painful, but arresting, like a hand placed on her shoulder from behind. She stopped walking. She kept her face still. She fixed her eyes on the wall across the room and breathed through it. Alaric felt it too. She knew because the conversation at his table stopped. She did not look at him. She heard the shift of his chair and the small silence of a man collecting himself. Then the conversation resumed, slightly louder than before, as if volume could cover what had just happened. She walked away and did not come near the table again. But something had changed after that night. The mark on her wrist burned more frequently. She slept worse. The pull of the bond was strengthening, and she could not tell if it was because the wedding was approaching or because of something else. Some pressure building in the space between them, like weather in a closed room. And then Marin came to her room late on a Tuesday evening, not with tea this time, but with a look that Seraphina had not seen on her face before. Careful, almost reluctant. "I need to tell you something," Marin said, "about your mother, and about what you are." Seraphina sat down on the edge of her cot. The candle between them was steady. Outside, the moon had risen, and through the small window it laid a stripe of light across the stone floor that seemed, just slightly, to lean toward Seraphina rather than falling straight. She looked at Marin. "Tell me," she said. The old woman sat and folded her hands and began. Bastian found Seraphina at the end of the east corridor at the same hour he always made his round. But on this night, 3 weeks before the wedding, he was not walking his usual unhurried pace. He was moving quickly, and the expression on his broad, weathered face was one she had never seen on him before. Something between urgency and anger held very tightly under control. "You need to come with me," he said. "Now. Quietly." She followed without asking. She had learned to trust the economy of his words. He led her to a storeroom at the far end of the servants' quarters wing, lit a single candle, and closed the door. Then he turned to her and said, "Someone has been in your room." Seraphina went still. "When?" "An hour ago. One of the younger girls saw Lady Celeste near the door. He met her eyes. I checked afterward. The moonstone ring. The small one from the south display case. The one the head steward reported missing 3 days ago. It was in the box under your cot." The silence that followed was complete. Seraphina understood the architecture of what had been built against her with the same speed that she understood most things. Quickly, clearly, and without the cushioning of disbelief. Celeste had taken the ring. Celeste had placed it where it would be found, and now someone, probably not Celeste herself, but someone who worked for Celeste, someone closer to the king's ear, would report it. "How long do I have?" Seraphina asked. "I don't know," Bastian said. "Maybe tonight. Maybe morning." She thought about the ring. She thought about removing it from the box and replacing it somewhere neutral. But that would mean touching it, and if anyone was watching, it would look worse. She thought about going to the king directly and dismissed it in the same breath. He had already decided what she was to him. Evidence would not change that. It would only be her word against Celeste's, and she was a bondservant, and Celeste was the future queen. "Is Marin awake?" she asked. "I can get her." "Do," Seraphina said. "And Bastian, thank you." He nodded once, the way he did everything, without extra. He opened the door and was gone. She stood in the storeroom with the candle and thought about the voice she heard at night. Endure. She pressed her hand against her wrist. The mark was blazing now, hotter than she had ever felt it, as if it knew what was coming and could not help reacting. She had done nothing wrong. She had never done anything wrong in 11 years of this palace, and it had never mattered. What mattered was power, and proximity to it, and the willingness of the powerful to look where they were pointed. She blew out the candle and went back to her room and lay down on her cot, with her hands folded on her chest and her eyes open in the dark. Above her, through the ceiling and the stone and the open sky, the moon was there. Full tonight, entirely full, and climbing. She did not sleep. When they came for her in the early hours of the morning, 2 palace guards and the king's secretary, she was already dressed. She stood and went with them without a word. The ring was still in the box under her cot. She did not touch it. She did not explain. She waited until she was standing in front of Alaric in his private receiving room, with Lord Harwick behind him and Celeste beside him, both of them wearing the expressions of people who had already written the ending. Celeste told her story simply and with tears. She had gone to check on Seraphina out of concern. She had been worried, she said, touching her own hand with practiced distress. And she had glimpsed the box open on the floor. She had not wanted to believe it. But the ring was there. The head steward could confirm which ring it was. Alaric looked at Seraphina. "Do you have anything to say?" he asked. She looked back at him. His face was the king's face, shut, decided, done with uncertainty. She looked at Celeste beside him, perfectly composed behind her tears. She looked at Lord Harwick, who was watching her the way one watches a door being permanently closed. "The ring was placed there," Seraphina said. "I did not take it." "By whom?" Alaric said. "By the person who benefits most from my punishment," she said. Celeste made a quiet sound. Lord Harwick stepped forward with an expression of wounded dignity and began speaking. Alaric raised one hand, and Lord Harwick stopped. The king looked at Seraphina for a long moment. Something moved in his eyes. Not doubt, but something that was afraid of doubt. Something that could not afford to let doubt in, because if doubt came in, other things would follow it. He looked away from her. "You will be held in the lower cell until the matter is formally reviewed," he said. "This is the procedure." "Of course," Seraphina said. She was taken down 2 sets of stairs, through a corridor that smelled of old stone and standing water, and placed in a room that had a window too high to see through and a door that locked from the outside. She sat on the bench. She folded her hands. Above her, she could not see it, but she knew it was there, the full moon, climbing toward the center of the sky. The mark on her wrist was not burning anymore. It was glowing. A steady, warm gold, like a small lamp in her skin, and the warmth was moving up her arm, into her chest, and the voice was there again, no longer distant, no longer a murmur. Not endure this time. This time it was something else entirely. Something that sounded like a door opening. Something that sounded like now. The wedding had been planned for a week from the day Seraphina was put in the cell, but it was moved forward. Lord Harwick pushed for it, and Alaric agreed. By the time the formal review of the ring matter had been scheduled, the ceremony had already been announced for the following morning. The review was quietly postponed. Seraphina remained in the lower cell. On the night before the wedding, Marin came. Seraphina did not know how the old woman had managed it. She suspected Bastian had something to do with the guard's convenient absence from the corridor, but the door opened and Marin stepped in, carrying a small lamp and moving with the unhurried calm of someone who had been managing difficult situations since before most people in the palace had been born. She sat beside Seraphina on the bench. She did not speak for a moment, just looked at the mark on Seraphina's wrist, glowing steadily in the dim room. "It's getting stronger," Marin said. "Yes," Seraphina said. "Are you afraid?" Seraphina thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I am tired, but I am not afraid." Marin looked at her for a long time. Then she said something she had only begun to say on that night in the servants' quarters, the night she had started to tell Seraphina about her mother. She said it fully now, without holding anything back. She spoke quietly and steadily for a long time, and Seraphina listened without interrupting. Her mother had not simply been a lord's wife who died young. Her mother had come from a bloodline that the histories had not recorded accurately, because the people who kept the histories had reasons to leave certain things out. There were women in the oldest records, before kings, before pack law, before any of the structures that men had built to organize power into shapes they could control. Women who were chosen not by birth or by marriage, but by the goddess herself, not through ceremony, through nature, through the bond, and through something older than the bond. They were called daughters of the light, and when the goddess needed to act in the world, she acted through them. Marin reached into her coat and took out a small book, very old, the cover worn to nothing. She placed it in Seraphina's hands. The pages were filled with writing so old the letters had changed shape, but here and there Seraphina could make out words. Chosen, light, crown. Your mother knew what she was, Marin said. She kept it quiet because it was safer. She passed it to you whether she meant to or not. The bond tonight was not the first time the goddess touched you. She looked at Seraphina steadily. It was just the first time you were ready to feel it. Seraphina held the book. The mark on her wrist pulsed once, strongly, and the warmth moved through her like a wave. From above the high window came a light, not lamplight, not torchlight, a gold so deep it was almost amber, pressing through the stone as though the stone were nothing. The lamp in Marin's hand went out. The light from the window did not. It is the full moon tonight, Marin said softly, and her voice had gone very quiet, the way voices go in the presence of something much larger than the speaker. And above, in the palace hall, the wedding ceremony is beginning. Seraphina looked at the window. The gold light was spreading, filling the cell, and it was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that comes from something that has been waiting a long time and is only now arriving. She stood. The book fell from her hands, and the pages blew open in a wind that had no source. What do I do? She asked. Marin looked at her. The old woman's eyes were bright, and she was smiling, not the small, careful smile of a woman who managed difficult situations, but something much more open than that. Nothing, Marin said. You have already done everything you needed to do. You endured. The door of the cell opened, not from the outside. The lock simply gave. The old iron releasing with a sound like a long-held breath finally let go, and the door swung inward. Beyond it, the corridor was full of the same gold light, filling the low space from floor to ceiling. Seraphina walked out. She did not run. She walked. Through the corridor, up the 2 sets of stairs, through doors that opened before she reached them, through corridors, where every candle blazed up as she passed. Servants she knew pressed back against the walls, watching her with wide eyes. The mark on her wrist was fully alight now, the crescent blazing gold through her skin, and the warmth had become something she could feel in her bones, in her breath, in the specific gravity of each step she took. She heard the ceremony before she reached the hall, the high priest's voice, carrying the old words, the gathered silence of hundreds. She put her hand against the great doors. They opened. The hall stopped. Every head turned. A king's wedding, in full ceremony, with the moonstone arch gleaming above the altar, and Alaric standing at the center, in formal black and celeste, beside him in the white silk gown that Seraphina had spent 30 nights sewing. And all of it stopped because the woman walking through the great doors was trailing gold light like a second train, and her eyes were silver, and the mark on her wrist was burning so brightly it lit the faces of the people nearest the aisle. Alaric went rigid. Seraphina watched his face cycle through things in rapid succession. Shock, fury, then something that looked, briefly, like relief, which he shut down immediately. Celeste's face went white. The high priestess, not the priest, but the senior priestess, old as Marin and twice as steady, stepped forward from her place beside the altar. She looked at Seraphina for a long moment. Then she looked up, at the moonstone arch above the altar, which had begun to glow. The gold light from above met the gold light from Seraphina at the center of the hall. What happened next was not in any of the ceremony texts, or any of the law books, or any of the histories that had been carefully edited to leave certain things out. It was not announced, or planned, or requested by any lord or any pack alpha in attendance. The moon goddess came. Not in a human body, not in a shape anyone could name completely, but in a presence that filled the hall from floor to roof, and pressed against every person there, with a weight that was not unkind, but was absolute. The moonstone arch blazed from gold to white, to a color that had no name. Every candle in the hall went out. The light that replaced them was everywhere, sourceless, and in it, every face was fully visible, every expression without shelter. She spoke without a voice, which meant everyone heard her at once, in whatever language lived deepest in them. What she said was not long. It did not need to be. She named what Alaric had done, not with condemnation, but with the clarity of simple fact. The way you describe a wound. Here is what happened. Here is what it was. He had found his fated mate, the woman the goddess had made for him, and he had turned her into a servant and locked her below his house. He had used an old law as a cage. He had chosen his own comfort over the sacred tie, and he had spent months watching her carry trays and press gowns and sew his wedding clothes, and he had told himself it was necessary. The hall was completely still. The king's crown lifted from Alaric's head on its own. Not snatched, lifted, slowly, with a deliberateness that was almost gentle, as if to say, "This was never truly yours, and we are simply correcting that now." Alaric reached up involuntarily and then stopped, because there was no force in the world in that hall except the one that was already speaking, and everyone in the room knew it. The crown hung in the air above the altar. The mark on Alaric's wrist, the faint, suppressed echo of the mate bond that had been fighting his rejection for months, went dark. Not violently. It simply went out, like a lamp at the end of its oil. He made a sound, just once, low and involuntary. The wolf inside him, his alpha nature, the power that came with his blood and his crown and everything he had inherited, it contracted. It diminished. It did not vanish entirely, but it drew back to something much smaller and quieter, and every alpha in the hall felt it happen, because that kind of power has a sound when it leaves, the way a storm has a sound when it ends. Celeste stepped backward. She hit the edge of the altar and grabbed it. Her face was unreadable, no tears now, no performance of distress, just a woman looking at a situation she had not planned for and finding, for the first time, that she had no move left. The crown moved to Seraphina. She felt it settle on her head before she could decide what to do about it, and the weight of it was not what she expected. It was not heavy. It was warm. The same warmth that had been in her chest since the night of the ceremony, since the first time the voice said, "Endure," and as it settled, she felt something click into place inside her that she had not known was misaligned. As if something had been waiting in her for this her whole life, and was only now being allowed to arrive. The presence in the hall receded, not all at once, but like a tide going back. The nameless light faded to the ordinary candlelight of 100 relighted flames. The moonstone arch quieted. What was left was a hall full of people, a woman standing in a worn gray dress with a crown on her head, and a man beside the altar who was no longer a king. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the high priestess knelt. She was the first, and every person in that hall understood that it mattered, who knelt first and what it meant. After her, the pack alphas, one by one, starting with the eldest and moving through the room like a slow wave. Then the lords. Then every person standing. Every person except Alaric, who stood very still beside the altar, with his hands at his sides and his face containing something she did not have a name for yet. Celeste did not kneel either. She straightened, lifted her chin, and walked out of the hall through a side door, and no one stopped her. Seraphina stood in the center of it all and breathed, just breathed, steadily, the way she had breathed through every cold morning and every humiliation and every long night over a wedding gown that was never going to be for her. The crown was warm on her head. The mark on her wrist had gone quiet, not dark, but settled. The blazing faded to a steady glow, like something that had finished its argument and was content to simply exist. She looked at the hall full of kneeling people and thought about what came next. Not revenge. That was not what was in her chest. What was in her chest was something more demanding than revenge. A responsibility, a weight she had not chosen, but was not going to put down. She had work to do. She looked, once, at Alaric. He met her eyes. For the first time since the night of the ceremony, he did not look away. She looked away first, because she had other things to attend to. Within the first week, the bond claim law was abolished, not suspended, not reviewed, struck from the law texts entirely, at the new Queen's order, signed in the old hall where Seraphina had once pressed her own hand to the document that bound her. The palace keeper who had stood with the pen that first night said nothing when she signed the abolishment beside him. He kept his eyes on the parchment. His hands were very steady. The court was uncertain in the way that courts are always uncertain when the map they have been using suddenly shows a different country. The pack alphas who had knelt in the hall had knelt out of witnessing. They had seen what happened, and they were wolves, and wolves understand the difference between a crown given by politics and a crown given by something older. But understanding it and being easy with it were different things. Seraphina understood this. She had spent 11 years watching how power worked from the angle of someone with none of it, which meant she had seen things that the people at the top of it never noticed about themselves. She knew which lords were uncertain because they were worried about their alliances. She knew which alphas were waiting to see if she could hold the territory. She knew that the first challenge would come not from a dramatic confrontation, but from a quiet test, something small, designed to see how she responded. It came in the second week. The eastern border packs had been having trouble with rogue wolves. Wolves who had left their packs and were moving through the border territory in groups, unsettled and dangerous. Under Alaric, the response had been to send soldiers and deal with it the way soldiers deal with things. The rogues had not stopped. Seraphina read every report on the situation. She called in Bastion, who knew the East from 20 years of patrol rotations, and Marin, who knew the history of why wolves went rogue in the first place. She listened for 2 hours without interrupting. Then, she sent 3 messengers, one to the nearest Eastern Pack Alpha, one to the rogue group's last known location, and one to the border village elders. She went herself. Not with an army, but with a small company, Bastion, 2 advisors, 4 guards, to the meeting point she had named. The rogue wolves came because she had asked, not commanded, and because the message she had sent was not an ultimatum. It was an acknowledgement. She told them, in writing, that she knew why they had left their packs. The Eastern Territories had been mismanaged for 3 years. The old pack laws applied unevenly. The smaller packs stripped of resources during a drought, while the larger ones were compensated. She named the specific failures. She did not excuse them, and she said she intended to correct them, and she invited them to tell her, in person, what else she had missed. They came, 12 wolves, lean and watchful, standing in a field at the edge of the forest, with the wind behind them, and every escape route already measured. Seraphina stood in front of them without armor and without a weapon, and with the crown quiet on her head and the mark steady on her wrist. Bastion stayed 3 steps back, as instructed. She talked to them for 3 hours. She did not offer them amnesty as a gift. She offered it as an arrangement. They returned to registered territory. She addressed the specific resource failures. The pack alphas who had driven them out would be formally reviewed. In exchange, the border violence stopped. 7 of the 12 took the arrangement immediately. 3 said they needed time. 2 left without agreeing. 2 out of 12 was better than Bastion had expected. She could see it on his face on the ride back. "You were worried," she said. "I was prepared," he said. "For what?" "For them not to listen," he said. "People in that position, wolves who have been pushed out and have nothing, they do not usually trust a crown." "I know," Seraphina said. "I have spent 11 years not trusting one." He looked at her sideways and then said, quietly, "Your mother would have done the same thing." She looked at him. The road was quiet around them, afternoon light slanting through the trees. "You knew her," she said. It was not a question. Marin had told her enough that she had suspected it. "I knew her well enough," Bastion said. He did not offer more than that. She did not push. Some things were theirs to hold, and not hers to take. Back in the palace, the work continued. She learned the treasury, not from the reports, which had been cleaned before they reached the previous king's desk, but from the actual ledgers, which she asked for directly, and which took the treasury clerk 3 days to produce, because no one had requested them before. She learned which lords held genuine authority, and which held inherited titles that had outlasted the substance. She met with the high priestess weekly, not for ceremony, but for the history that the priestess kept in her head. The real history, the unedited version, the one that included the daughters of the light, and the things that had been deliberately obscured. Through all of it, she was aware of Alaric in the way you are aware of weather, not always thinking about it, but never quite unaware. He had been moved to quarters in the palace's north wing, on the order of the council, which had managed the transition with the efficiency of a body that had been looking for a reason to do it for some time. He received no official title. He had no duties. He had, as far as the court was concerned, simply become a private person, living in a room that had once been a guest suite. She heard things, in the fractured way you hear things about someone you are not watching. He had stopped eating in the formal dining room. He had been seen in the stable yard. He was quiet. He was not causing problems. The mark on her wrist was stable. The severed bond had left a kind of neutral space where the pull had been. Not empty exactly, but undemanding. She could feel that he was in the palace the way you can feel a change in barometric pressure. Real, measurable, not painful. She did not seek him out. She was busy, and she was not ready, and she was not sure ready was even the right word, for whatever it would take to know what to do with what was between them. Celeste had disappeared the night of the ceremony, and was rumored to be at her father's estate in the southern province. Lord Harwick had arrived at the palace 3 days after the ceremony, with a delegation and a prepared speech about realignment and loyalty. Seraphina had received him in the formal throne room, with the high priestess and 4 council members present, and she had listened to the speech without expression, and then she had said, very simply, "Lord Harwick, your armies were the reason a king put a chain on his fated mate, rather than challenge you. I am not interested in your armies. You may take your delegation home." He had left red-faced and silent. The council members had exchanged looks she chose not to address. One evening, near the end of the 2nd month, she was in the library, the real library, the deep one, with the records that predated the current dynasty, when she heard footsteps she recognized without looking up. She kept her eyes on the page. Alaric stopped at the edge of the lamplight. He was wearing plain clothes, dark, simple, nothing that suggested rank. He looked like a man who had spent weeks deciding something, and still was not certain he had decided right. "I am not going to ask for anything," he said. "I am not here to argue or to plead." She turned a page. "Then why are you here?" A long pause. "Because I owe you something," he said, "and I have not been able to figure out how to say it without it sounding like what it is." "What is it?" "An apology," he said. "A real one, not a political one." She looked up at him. He was watching her, with an expression that was nothing like the king's face. No armor, no decision already made, no looking away. Just a man standing in lamplight, genuinely uncertain whether what he was offering was worth anything at all. She considered him for a moment. "Sit down," she said. He looked surprised. He sat in the chair across the table. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Tell me what you were thinking that night, in the lower hall, when you decided." He was quiet for a moment. Then he began, haltingly at first, and then with a steadiness that came from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something in silence for too long. He told her what he had thought. He told her what he had been afraid of. He told her about the armies, and his father's instructions about the match with Celeste, and the way he had convinced himself that a legal status was different from what it actually was. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the lamp had burned lower. "You knew it was wrong," she said, "not as an accusation, as a fact." "Yes," he said. "From the beginning." "Yes." She nodded. She looked at the page in front of her, which she had not read a word of since he arrived. "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me," she said. He had no response to that. He sat with it. "I accept the apology," she said. "It does not change what happened. It does not rebuild anything, but I accept it." He let out a breath. "I am not asking for anything in return," he said again. "I know," she said. "That is why I accepted it." She went back to her reading. He sat quietly for a moment, and then he rose to leave. At the edge of the light, he paused. "Seraphina," he said. Her name, her actual name, for the first time, without a title or a legal designation attached to it. She looked up. "You are a better ruler than I ever was," he said. "I do not say that to flatter you." "I know," she said. He left. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she looked at the mark on her wrist, steady, warm, settled. She pressed her hand flat against it, the way she had that first night in the lower hall, after she signed the document, when she had stood alone with burning skin and a silent vow. She had kept the vow. She turned to the next page. The coup came, as Alaric had known it would, on the night of the festival of the full moon. He had been sitting in the far end of a narrow tavern near the southern market, not drinking, because he had found that the act of sitting in a place full of ordinary noise helped with the particular kind of silence his quarters had become, when 2 men entered and took the table behind him and began talking in the quiet, certain way of people who do not believe anyone important is near enough to hear. He had been carrying stone for 6 weeks, not because it was required of him. He was technically still a resident of the North Wing, not a laborer, but because he had needed something that was real and measurable, work that had a clear relationship between effort and outcome, which was a thing he had not understood the value of when he was a king. The stable master had put him to use without asking questions, which Alaric appreciated more than he could have explained. The 2 men behind him were not careful enough. They were nervous, and nervous people talked more than careful ones. What he pieced together, in the space of 20 minutes, was enough. Lord Roman Carver, the festival, Silver and Wolfsbane, the Queen. He left the tavern without finishing what was in his cup and walked fast toward the palace. He did not run. Running would draw attention, and the festival streets were crowded with people, but he moved with the focused speed of a man who had remembered something essential about himself that months of quiet had temporarily covered. He was not a good king. He had proved that thoroughly, but he had been trained since childhood in threat response, and that training, unlike the crown, had not been taken from him. He knew the festival layout. He knew where the queen would be, the central courtyard, the ceremonial lighting of the moonfire, surrounded by dignitaries and pack representatives, and not nearly enough guards for an ambush with silver weapons. The guards who were there would be watching outward, for an obvious approach. An attack from within the gathered crowd was the angle he would have chosen, and it was clearly the angle Roman had chosen as well. He entered the palace through the stable yard, went up through the servants' passages, and reached the courtyard from the east side 3 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin. He could see Seraphina from 40 feet away, in formal white now, the crown on her head, speaking with the high priestess at the edge of the moon fire pit. Her back was to him. He searched the crowd. 3 people who had not been there on his way through 20 minutes earlier, positioned at intervals that were too deliberate to be accidental. Silver-edged weapons would be underneath their coats. He had no weapon. He had not carried one since the ceremony. He had no authority to call the guards to him, and if he shouted, the attackers would move immediately. He walked to the nearest guard post, got the attention of a guard he recognized from his previous life, and spoke quickly and clearly into the man's ear. The guard looked at him with an expression of complicated history. This was his former king, who was currently a stable hand, telling him there was an active threat. The guard looked at the crowd. He had good instincts. Alaric saw him see the positioning. The guard moved. He would alert the others, but the crowd was shifting with the beginning of the ceremony, and Alaric could see the nearest attacker moving with it, getting closer, using the movement as cover. He was not going to reach the guards in time. He moved through the crowd without pushing, slipping between people with the specific skill of someone who had spent months becoming invisible, and he reached the space between the attacker and Seraphina at the moment the attacker's hand came out of his coat. He stepped in front of her. The silver blade caught him across the left side, below the ribs. He felt the wolfsbane in it immediately, a burning, numbing cold that spread fast, and he went down to one knee, and the guards were there in the next 4 seconds, and the attacker was taken, and the other 2 were reached before they could act, and the ceremony stopped. Seraphina turned. She was at his side before he had fully processed that he was on the ground. He looked up at her and had the strange experience of seeing, for the first time, what her face looked like when she was afraid. She was not a person who showed fear easily, and he understood why. 11 years of practice, but it was there now, clear and undisguised. "How bad?" she said. "Not as bad as it could be," he said, which was true. "The silver will slow the healing." "Stop talking," she said. She had her hand pressed against his side, and her eyes were the silver they went when the goddess was close, and warmth was coming from her palm, in a way that cut through the wolfsbane cold. She was doing something without knowing she was doing it, or possibly knowing exactly. He was not entirely clear on the limits of what she could do. He was also in enough pain that his ability to analyze the situation was compromised. "I heard about the plot," he said, because he felt he needed to explain. "Be quiet," she said. "I am not asking for anything," he said. "I need you to know that. I did not come here for that. I said be quiet." He was quiet. Marin arrived with a kit and practical commands, and the guards cleared space, and Bastian appeared from nowhere and stood over Alaric with the specific posture of a man who had decided something about someone and was prepared to enforce it. Alaric found that he did not mind this. He was moved inside. He was treated The wolf's bane worked out of his system in 4 hours, slowly, because the silver had gotten in deep enough to slow everything, and for those 4 hours he was in significant pain that he did not complain about, because it seemed like the least appropriate thing in the world to complain about. Seraphina came twice to the room where he was being kept. The second time, she stayed. She sat in the chair beside the bed and did not speak immediately, and he did not push her to. They sat in a quiet that was different from any quiet that had ever existed between them before. Not the silence of avoidance, not the silence of a decision already made, but the silence of two people who were genuinely uncertain what came next. Roman's assets will be frozen, she said finally. He will face formal charges. Good, he said. Celeste's involvement is being investigated. She will not be permitted to return to the palace. Also good. Another silence. Then she said, "Why did you not call out or run?" He had thought about this during the 4 hours. He had a clear, honest answer. Because I could not reach the guards in time, he said, and because it was you. She looked at him. The silver in her eyes was quiet now, just the green that was her mother's color. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was watching him with the full, assessing attention he had spent 11 years avoiding and now could not look away from. "You could have been killed," she said. "Yes. And you knew that." "Yes." She was quiet again for a moment, then she said, very carefully, "I am not going to restore the bond." He had expected this. "I know. That decision was taken from me once," she said. "I will not give it away. Not to anyone, not even—" She stopped. She looked at her hands. "My life is mine," she said. "The crown is mine. What I choose to do with either is mine to decide." "Yes," he said. "It should always have been." She looked up at him. Something in her face shifted. Not toward warmth exactly, but toward something that was the first condition of warmth. Recognition. The acknowledgement of a person seeing another person clearly, and choosing to go on looking. "You need to rest," she said. "I am resting." "You need to stop talking and rest." "Seraphina," he said. She looked at him. "I am sorry," he said. Not the apology from the library, which had been true, but incomplete. This one included everything the library version had left out. It included the nights she had worked over the wedding gown. It included the morning the guards came for her. It included Celeste's tears and the ring under the cot, and the cell with the high window, and every single choice he had made that had put her there. It was not a good apology. It could not be a good apology, because no apology could carry all of that. But he meant every word of it, and they both knew the difference between meaning and not meaning. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. She rose. At the door she paused, the way he had paused in the library, and she turned back. "When you are well," she said, "you may return to the stables if you choose. Bastian will arrange it." A pause. "The work suits you," she said, "in my opinion." She left. He lay in the dim room and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had said, and had not said, and what the space between them had become. Not what it was supposed to be, not what the goddess had intended in the simple mechanics of the bond, but something that had been built in the worst conditions possible and had survived them. Something that had no name yet, which meant it was still being made. He could work with that. He was at the stable yard by the following week. The sentencing of Roman Carver was held in the formal throne room, with full court attendance, and Seraphina presided over it from the chair she had learned to sit in without thinking about it. Spine straight, hands still, voice even. Roman stood in the center of the floor and did not look at her, which was fine. She was not asking him to. She sentenced him fairly, which meant she sentenced him seriously. There were packs in the eastern region that would need years of rebuilding from the mismanagement she was still uncovering. Roman, as a lord with holdings in that region, had contributed to the conditions that created the rogue crisis. He had then tried to solve that crisis by removing the queen who was fixing it. He would have his title stripped, his holdings transferred to a governance council that would work with the Eastern Pax directly, and he would serve 10 years in managed labor in the border village that had suffered most from the drought years. Not death, not exile into nothing. Labor, which she had learned recently, was not a lesser punishment, but often a more enduring one. He was taken out. Celeste was not present for sentencing. The investigation had confirmed her involvement in funding 2 of Roman's operatives, and the formal decree had been prepared. Seraphina read it aloud in the same room, with the same court watching. Celeste's family name was stripped. She was not imprisoned. Seraphina had thought carefully about this, and imprisonment would have made her a martyr in certain quarters, and martyrs were more dangerous than exiles. She was assigned to the eastern border villages for 3 years of community service under direct supervision. The same villages she had looked past from a palace window her entire life without seeing. It was, Seraphina thought, proportionate. Not merciful in the soft sense, but proportionate, which was its own kind of mercy, the kind that gave a person a direction to walk in, rather than just a door that closed. Lord Harwick, who had funded none of it and known about all of it, was the most complicated case. He had armies, which she no longer needed in the way Alaric had needed them, because the Eastern Pact's loyalty had become a different kind of military reality than inherited soldiers. She did not strip him of his title, but she audited his holdings formally and published the results, which was a punishment he had not anticipated and could not argue with. Public knowledge was, she had found, a more reliable check on a man like Harwick than any formal sanction. He remained in his estate, reduced in influence, watched carefully. She did not waste energy hating him. She was busy. The months that followed were the busiest of her life and the most fully lived. She worked on the Eastern Territories and saw the rogue situation resolve itself as the underlying conditions changed. She worked on the law texts and found, buried in the older records, a set of protections for bondmates that predated the old king's law by 2 centuries and had been written out of the official codes during a period when it was politically convenient to remove them. She restored them. She added to them. She met with the high priestess regularly, and through those meetings came to understand more fully what she was and what the mark meant and what the goddess's presence in her life was. Not a constant intervention, not a guarantee, but a relationship, something mutual. She had endured, and in doing so, she had proven something about herself that made her a vessel worth using. And now she was in a conversation with the oldest thing she knew, and that conversation had no ending she could see from where she stood, which she found she did not mind. Marin's health was failing. She had been old before any of this happened, and the months since the ceremony had not been gentle to her. Seraphina sat with her in the evenings whenever she could, in the herb garden where they had first sat together, and they talked about her mother and about the old book and about what it meant to endure things not as a passive act, but as an active choice, made again and again, in the small hours when no one was watching. "You are happy," Marin said one evening, with the satisfied assessment of someone who has been waiting to deliver this verdict. "I am busy," Seraphina said. "Those are not the same thing," Marin said. "But I notice you did not say no." Seraphina looked at the moon above the garden. It was not full tonight, just a crescent, her crescent, the shape of the mark on her wrist, the shape that had been burning on her skin since the night of the ceremony, and was still there, settled and quiet, and entirely hers. Alaric was in the stable yard. She could feel the general direction of him in the way she could always feel the general direction of him. The neutral space where the bond had been was not nothing, exactly. It was more like a cleared field. What grew in a cleared field depended on what was planted. She was not in a hurry. There were things she needed to finish first, things she needed to be certain of, about herself and about him, and about what it would mean to choose something freely that had once been forced upon her. Those were not small things to be certain of. But she was not opposed to the cleared field. She was not opposed to what it might, in time, become. She pressed her hand against her wrist, feeling the warmth of the mark. The crown was steady on her head. The kingdom was a real thing she was holding, imperfect and demanding, and genuinely hers. Seasons from now, she would walk out to the stable yard on a morning when the light was right and offer him one honest conversation. Not the first honest thing between them. That had been happening, in libraries and dim rooms and quiet corridors, for months. But the first one offered freely, without necessity, without anything needing to be proved or resolved. Just 2 people choosing to begin something that had no name yet. But that was seasons from now. Tonight, the garden was quiet, and the moon was a crescent above the herb rows, and Marin was talking about something her mother had said once, a long time ago, in a room Seraphina had never seen. She listened. She was good at listening. She had learned it the hard way, in the long years when no one was listening to her, and like most things learned the hard way, she had learned it completely. The crown was hers, The choice was hers. The future was a cleared field in good light. She was ready for it.